Hi True Crime family, my name is Manju and welcome back to my channel where we talk about true crime cases from around the world. Today we're going to be traveling to Virginia, USA. One Saturday late afternoon on January 8, 1949, 32-year-old Ruby Floyd entered a predominantly African American neighborhood with 11-year-old Charlie Martin in Martinsville, Virginia, to collect money for clothing she had sold. She had asked for directions from four young men who were along the railroad tracks who were passing bottles of alcohol. As Ruby and Charlie passed by, 19-year-old Joel Hampton told his friends the woman looked good enough to hug. He vowed to catch the woman when she returned. 10 minutes later, Ruby and Charlie came back after collecting the $6, and Joe came up to them and bear hugged Ruby when she tried to run away. He then threw a quarter towards Charlie and told him to get lost. Ruby tried to escape Joe's hold, but he held on to her tight and took her to the woods. Ruby said for 90 minutes, the men took turns raping her. Other men passing by would hear her cries, but instead of helping her, they would join in on the gang rape. Around 7:30 that evening, two Good Samaritans found Ruby. Most of her clothes were missing. Her legs and arms were scraped raw, and her hair was tangled with twigs and pine needles. They helped Ruby get to Mary Wade's house, and when Mary saw her, she described the scene as heartbreaking. When she opened the door, she saw Ruby only wearing a shirt, sweater, and slip. There were scratches on her arms. Her clothes were kind of hanging off her, and her hair was tangled up. Her thighs were red rubbed like. The family then called 911. Police and paramedics soon arrived at the home. Ruby claimed she was grabbed by the four men she passed by on the train tracks and who had paid Charlie Martin a quarter to disappear, to keep his mouth shut. She testified that they dragged her and attacked her near a secluded train track where they were joined by three more. After taking Ruby's testimony, Detective Murray Barrow had arrested two young black men just after midnight. Frank Hairstone Jr., who confessed to raping Ruby, and Book T. Milner, who admitted that he was at the scene but denied raping the woman. Based on these confessions, another officer, A.T. Finley, arrested James L. Hairston, Howard Lee Hairston, John C. Taylor, and Francis DeSales Grayson at their homes between 3:30 and 4 o'clock a.m. By 7:30 a.m., the police had obtained confessions from all four, although Grayson and Howard Hairston denied raping the victim. Early Monday morning on January 10th, the police arrested the final suspect, Joe Hampton. By 10:35 a.m., Sergeant Barnes had a signed confession from each suspect, in which they admitted their part in the attack and implicated the others as well. Most of the men were between 18 and the mid-20s, except Francis Grayson, who was a World War II veteran and was 37 years old. He was married and was a father of 5 children. Most of the men worked as laborers in local furniture factories, and all of the men were from East Martinsville, which was considered the colored side of the town, compared to West Martinsville, which was the white side of the town. None of the men had serious criminal backgrounds. Joe Hampton had received a suspended sentence for grand larceny. Booker Milner had been fined for public drunkenness, and John Taylor had been arrested on minor sex charge in 1944. When Ruby was told to identify the rapist, she could immediately identify Francis Grayson and Joe Hampton, but since the attack happened at night, she couldn't identify the others. However, in the end, 7 men did face rape charges. According to the men, the interrogations were a no-win situation. According to them, the law was used to entrap young black men accused of assaulting the virtues of a young white woman. The MO was the same: surround the accused with white police officers and give them the choice of confessing and praying for mercy in the courtroom, or pleading their innocence and taking their chances with the mob, which may or may not be present outside the police station. Reverend Robert Anderson, who is the pastor of Richmond's Fifth Baptist Church and spiritual minister to John Taylor, told the Richmond Afro-American newspaper that he was informed by two of the defendants of the improper interrogation. Both men claimed that they were seated in a chair surrounded by several white officers, while one allegedly held a nightstick over their heads, telling them that if they did not admit guilt, they would be beaten to death. Several of the other men said that they were told by the police that their companions had already confessed and implicated them, and if they did not confess, they would be handed over to a mob of 1,000 men waiting outside to kill you. In the confession, all admitted to being present at the crime. Most didn't know what they were signing since they were intoxicated and weren't able to read it properly, and they weren't allowed to consult lawyers or their families. Now, in 1931, there was a similar case, the case of the Scottsboro Boys, who were 9 teenagers that were falsely accused of raping 2 white women while on a train near Alabama. I will be talking about this case in the future, and let me tell you, it's a frustrating one. The uproar that this case caused and the role that this case had in the rise of the civil rights movement made Judge Whittle believe he needed to proceed with caution. It is believed that Judge Whittle knew of the stats of white versus black men who were convicted of rape. Now, the electric chair was introduced in 1908 in Virginia, and all of the 45 men who were executed for rape in Virginia were black men, convicted of attacking white women. Not one of the 808 white men convicted of rape in the same period had been executed. In fact, since 1608, no white man in Virginia who was convicted of rape had been executed. Now, Judge Whittle agreed to a request made by the defense team to hold individual trials except for Taylor and James Hairston, who agreed to be tried together. Judge Whittle also tried to get a mixed black and white jury, but that was rejected by the prosecution because they knew the black community was opposed to capital punishment. So in all the trials, the jury were white men. After the arrest, they kept the 7 men separate to protect them from the mob's violence. They took them to other jails outside of Henry County. The quick arrest was to reassure the community that stability was being preserved. Authorities showed increased professional conduct and procedures since this was a controversial arrest. The judge did appoint 7 attorneys for the 7 defendants. Few of them didn't have much experience, so the judge asked for the more experienced attorneys to aid the newer ones. The defense team tried to move the trial's location on the grounds of the opinionated press, and since this case was the talk of the town. This case had made the front page of the local newspapers as well, but Judge Whittle denied the motion for a change of venue. Now, the trials were held back to back, each with a separate jury of 12 white men. The prosecution was led by Irvin W. Cubine, and he introduced evidence showing that non-consensual sex took place. Some of the defendants acknowledged having sexual intercourse with Ruby, but said it was consensual or that she did not resist or say no. Now, Ruby Floyd testified in all 6 assembly line trials. At times, she took close to 40 minutes to identify the assailants. She could positively only identify 3 of her supposed assailants, since part of the attack happened at night. She quickly pointed to Joe Hamilton, as that was her first attacker, and then identified Francis DeSales Grayson as the last assailant. She did, however, hesitate between James Hairston and Booker Milner as the second assailant, saying that she was only certain that it was one of those 2. Juries also heard medical verification of Ruby's physical injuries and testimony from local residents she had appealed to for help after the rape. Defense lawyers tried to argue that their clients' confessions were coerced by the local police. All 7 black men admitted their presence at the attack, but only Frank Hairston freely admitted to raping Ruby. During trial, each of the men partially rejected their earlier confessions. Some claimed that the police had written the confessions and that when they signed, they did not notice that their own words and statements had been changed. Virginia law at that time authorized capital punishment for not just rape, but also attempted rape and for aiding and abetting. Thus, all the jurors convicted the young men of rape regardless of their roles. On May 4th, 1949, they recommended the death penalty for all 7 of them. After the convictions, civil rights lawyers Martin A. Martin and Oliver Hill requested statistics from the penitentiary. Martin received verifications from the superintendent that they had combed through the inmate records dating back to January 1st, 1908, and replied, "No white person has ever been electrocuted in Virginia for the crime of rape or attempted rape." But there were numerous black men. The punishments of white men raping black women in Virginia were barely slaps on a wrist. In January 1947, 2 white Richmond policemen, Carl Burleson and Leonard Davis, were convicted of raping a 32-year-old black woman named Strayhorn in the rear of their patrol car on a dead-end street. They were sentenced to only 7 years in the penitentiary. On October 16, 1948, Norfolk Journal and Guide reported that a white farmer in Amherst County raped a pregnant 19-year-old black woman. He was found guilty and only fined $350. Even more crazy was the rape of a colored woman by Merle Dudley, a white man near Glasgow, Virginia on August 29, 1948. According to the Norfolk Journal, Dudley was found guilty and fined $20. Martin wasn't afraid to say it, that the reason why these men were sentenced to the electric chair was because they were colored, and the victim was white, and the jurors were all white men. Many individuals, like Governor John S. Battle, argued that with the evidence the 7 men were guilty, but Martin made it clear that it wasn't that they were guilty or not. It was how fair the trial was, how fair the verdict was. How come white men barely get a slap on the wrist, but black men get the death sentence? Thousands of people from around the world wrote to Governor Battle, including writers and artists from Russia. They tried to warn Governor Battle that what he was doing was wrong and he shouldn't be allowing the executions to move forward. The NAACP and other organizations started mounting pressure on the state and national officials to step in. Newspapers wrote editorials, letters, among others to halt the execution of the 7 men. Local vigils were also held, with demonstrations in Washington and Harlem, marching in front of the White House to persuade the president, Harry S. Truman, to intervene. Now, according to the New York Times, the president did not want to get involved, and the governor of Virginia at that time denied a last-minute plea for a stay. On February 2nd, 1951, at 8:04 a.m., George Haley, a white Halifax County man, convicted of raping and murdering a 12-year-old girl who had nothing to do with the Martinsville cases, was executed first in an uninterrupted sequence of 5 executions, proving that even in death, the white man still goes first. Haley fought the guards all the way from his cell and even while he was strapped in the chair. Joe Hampton, in stark contrast to Haley, was solemn and composed. His last words were, "Everything's all right. We'll see you on the other side." He was declared dead at 8:12 a.m. He was followed by Howard Hairston at 8:22 a.m., who required a second charge to kill him. Booker Milner was found dead by 8:29 a.m., and finally, Frank Hairston was dead by 9:05 a.m. On February 5th, John Taylor went to the chair at 7:35 a.m. He was followed by James Hairston, who, like his brother, needed a second charge, and then it was Francis Grayson. All 3 were dead by 8:15 a.m. On March 1st, 1960, a bill was introduced in the General Assembly to abolish the death penalty, but it was defeated. 2 years later, with support for the death penalty at an all-time low, Virginia stopped executing. But in 1982, acting on a 1976 Supreme Court judgment, Virginia reinstated the death penalty by electrocuting Frank Coppola. In the years following, many people began to advocate for a pardon of the Martinsville Seven. Their fight wasn't about if the men were guilty or not, but more in the fact that they were treated unfairly simply for being black. These men weren't allowed to have lawyers. They were threatened to sign confessions while they were intoxicated, or weren't able to clearly read what they were signing. They were also threatened to confess to the rape, or else they would get beaten. Some lawyers believe if a proper investigation was done, some, if not all, would have been found innocent. But of course, we don't know that for certain, since the men aren't alive to hear their side of the story. The investigators twisted their words and treated them unfairly, all because of how they looked. From the beginning, everyone knew. The men knew what the result would be. There was no changing the minds of the prosecutors, the judge, the juries, and the investigators. It was all just a formality. 70 years after their execution, the Martinsville Seven were pardoned on August 2021 by Virginia's governor, who said that they were denied due process because of their race. The governor, Ralph Northam, announced the pardons after meeting the descendants of several of the men and their advocates. Northam said the death penalty for rape was applied exclusively to black people. He said from 1908, when Virginia began using the electric chair, to 1951, records show that all 45 people executed for rape were black. He also said, while these pardons do not address the guilt of the seven, they serve as recognition from the Commonwealth that these men were tried without adequate due process and received a racially biased death sentence, not similarly applied to white defendants. Here you see Rose Grayson, who is the niece of Francis Grayson, comforting on the left James Grayson, who was the son of Francis. And on the right is Rudy, who is the great-nephew of Francis. This is after Virginia Governor Ralph Northam issued posthumous pardons for Francis and the other 6 members during a ceremony in August 2021. Virginia is the first southern state to abolish capital punishment. On March 24th, 2021, Governor Ralph Northam signed legislation to end the death penalty in Virginia and reduce the sentences of the Commonwealth's 2 death row prisoners to life without parole. That is it for today's case. What are your thoughts? Leave them down below. Thank you for watching, and until next time, bye.